Thank you all for having me here. I am deeply honored and grateful for the invitation. And I want to thank all the local people for making me feel so welcome and gracious. And I want to thank the India Foundation, who has stepped up to arrange and sponsor all the details of what is a very packed month-long lecture tour. Amirican Veda came out 3 years ago in the U.S., and it took a while, but we finally got the English language edition released in India. And I had always determined that when the book came out, I would come to India, and if anybody would have me speak, I would gratefully do so. And as it turned out, the India Foundation stepped up, and I think I have more than one lecture per day over the course of a little more than a month. I'm midway through now, and I've been to 6 states and probably given 15 or 16 talks. And for me, this is extremely gratifying. To be able to come to India, which I consider my spiritual home. I'm very American. You know, I love baseball and I love rock and roll, and you know, I grew up in New York City, and you know, I'm an American sort of guy, but spiritually, I've always felt India was my spiritual home. And I'm not alone in that. There are millions of people like me, which is one of the messages of my book. And to be able to come here and give something, however small and however humble, back to the country whose spiritual heritage gave me so much and gave my loved ones so much, and as it turns out, gave my country so much, is extremely satisfying to me, and I'm grateful for the opportunity. As you've heard, the transmission of Sanatana Dharma to America began more than 200 years ago, when the first decent translations of the Gita and other texts found their way into the libraries of people like Ralph Waldo Emerson and Henry David Thoreau. And ever since then, influential people like Emerson and Thoreau, through right up until present day, have been attracted to the teachings primarily of the Vedanta and Yoga darshanas, but to the entire Hindu Dharma and the essence of what your rishis have given the world. And they absorb the teachings. The teachings transform their own lives, the way they see the world, their own consciousness, their own hearts, their own souls, and they, in some cases, expressed in English and in combined with their own insights and their own areas of expertise, the essence of the Dharmic teachings, and in that way the teachings filtered out into American society. Emerson has been called America's founding philosopher. He's compared to Plato. People have called him America's Plato. I call him America's Shankaracharya, because if you read him, you will see a sharp, and historically this is documented, he broke from the traditional church that ordained him and made him a minister and educated him, and started advocating a different way for people to understand religion and spirituality. And if you read his works from that period on, you see Advaita Vedanta in American language. So I think of him as our first Advaitin. And his influence and Thoreau's influence have continued to this day. Millions of Americans have read them and said, oh, look, you know, these heroes of American intellectual thought they say they owe a great debt to the teachings of India, to the Hindu and Buddhist dharmas. Thoreau, in his masterwork, Walden, calls himself a yogi. This is about 100 years before yoga studios popped up in his part of Massachusetts. and he talks about reading the Gita every morning. I interviewed over 300 Americans for my book and asked them how they got attracted to India's spiritual teachings, and many of them said, I was assigned Thoreau in high school or college, and if he liked this thing called the Bhagavad Gita, I thought I should go out and get a copy. And that was their introduction. That happened to me when I was a college student, only that was so long ago that I couldn't even find a copy of the Gita in New York City at the time. Well, now you can find, 20 different translations in any major bookstore or online. But that's how many of us found our way into the Dharmic teachings, was through eminent Westerners who had adopted the teachings, integrated them into their own areas of expertise, and transmitted them to us. It was not only Thoreau, it was Aldous Huxley, it was Alan Watts, it was Houston Smith who wrote the foreword to my book, and Joseph Campbell. These were all heroes to my generation of young Americans who were looking for new ideas. And the fact that they were speaking to us with a combination of Western expertise and essential Vedantic teachings mattered a great deal to us and led us then to go out and get a copy of the Gita or the Upanishads or the Patanjali or whatever it was, and open the floodgates in my generation to all the gurus who came in the 60s and 70s and reached millions of people. But the story goes back, as you heard, at least 200 years. The people who read Emerson and Thoreau were the primary audience for Swami Vivekananda when he came. They were primed to listen to him and hear him and embrace him. And right at the beginning, if you look at the details of Swamiji's experience in America, you'll see two kinds of Americans. This open-minded, curious, pluralistic American who embraces new ideas and takes on anything if it has any semblance of logic and evidence behind it, and the closed-minded, narrow-minded fundamentalists who attacked Swami Vivekananda, and we still have those two types of people in America. But the first type has prevailed over time, and is that first type that has increasingly, over time, found their way in one form or another to Sanatana Dharmic teachings. That accelerated over time and then exploded with my generation when we were young. And the inciting incident for that was when the Beatles came to Rishikesh in 1968, and everybody overnight discovered teachings of Vedanta and yoga. But I'll come back to that in a minute. You all know, people around the world know that there's been a lot of American seekers who find their way to India and have gurus and go to ashrams and become little young yogis, and you all are familiar with all the hippies that came in the 70s. And you know that there were great intellectuals like Thoreau and Emerson and Huxley and all the others. What many people don't know is the essence of American Veda and why I wrote the book, which was my life was transformed when I discovered Vedanta and yoga and started practicing meditation and other forms of teachings. I was a crazy young man, and then I became a saner young man, and my life ever since has centered around my own inner spiritual development based on Dharmic teachings. There are many, many people like me. But what I started to notice over time was that the teachings weren't just attracting hippies and beatniks and avant-garde bohemians and intellectuals on the fringe and artists and all the usual types. It was starting to impact mainstream America in a significant way, ordinary people. And it was filtering into the sort of heart and soul of mainstream life in America through medicine, through healthcare practitioners who started advocating yoga and meditation, through psychology, where the ideas that come from the Hindu and Buddhist dharmas started to affect how psychologists understand the mind and consciousness. It was coming through even physicists who were finding parallels in Vedantic cosmology to their theoretical work in quantum physics. It even was coming in the form of doctors recommending yogic practices and looking at the data about this. But it also started to influence how Americans see what religion is and understand what religion can be, and how they practice their own spirituality. Not just people like me who embraced the teachings overtly, but people who have been influenced by this subtle, profound spread of the core teachings into American life, many of whom have no idea they've been influenced by India, because they've heard it from their minister or their rabbi, a different way of looking at spiritual life, a different way of understanding religion and reality. They've heard it from their psychotherapist. They've heard it from their neighbor. They've heard it in many, many ways. They've heard it from Oprah. They've heard it from celebrities. They've heard it from George Harrison and the Beatles. They've heard it in many, many forms, different ideas that take root in their minds and their hearts, and they change the way they see the world. And in many cases, if you ask people what they believe in, and they start telling you, you say, oh, you're a Vedantist. And they may never have heard the word Vedanta. And if you ask them what's important to them about their spiritual life, and they'll start saying things like, oh, I want to achieve union with God. Oh, you're a yogi. Oh, but I don't stretch and bend on the floor like yogis do. No, but they have a yogic attitude. They are in their souls yogis looking for what yoga is and really is. And this is so common in America. It started to change the sort of fabric of life. A few years ago, as I was finishing my book, I was actually, frankly, cutting 50 pages because it was too long. And I had just done all this research. I had written the book. And one of the things I had done was look at the data on American religious attitudes and spiritual practices over the course of a few decades. Rigorous research that scholars and scientific agencies have done. And I saw a certain trend. I'll tell you in a minute. But Newsweek magazine, which was at that time the best-selling news weekly in America, in 2009, the religion editor wrote a one-page essay that got a tremendous amount of attention, because the headline was, "We are all Hindus now." And the first sentence was, America is not a Christian nation. Now, this came as quite a shock to that second kind of American I talked about, the Americans who not only believe America is a Christian nation, but thinks every nation should be a Christian nation. And they were rather upset by this headline and statement. And you saw letters to the editor and everything, people having fits of despair and anger. But the writer did not mean that Americans, massive numbers of Americans were going to stop going to their churches and synagogues and instead go to the mandirs that have, cropped up in all the cities of America. It didn't mean they were going to, the Christians were going to rip the crosses off their neck and put Ganesha medals on instead. They weren't going to stop celebrating Christmas or Easter and, only do Diwali and Shivaratri. It didn't mean that we were becoming Hindus in the sense that Hinduism is practiced in India and in Hindu communities in America. What she meant was, as she explained, recent poll data show that conceptually, at least, we are slowly becoming more like Hindus and less like traditional Christians in the ways we think about God, ourselves, each other, and eternity. And in that, she couldn't have been more accurate. In fact, I don't think she went far enough. That is a trend that is demonstrable. You can see it in the data, and that's what I did in the first chapter of my book. I looked at all these studies, and I summarized it. And here's the summary of the summary. Americans have moved from a belief-oriented way of looking at religion. It used to be, in some pockets it still is. People think of religion as something you believe in. And most Americans raised in a religion are told, this is what you have to believe in. And if it's a very conservative religion, an Orthodox religion, they're told, you have to believe in this, or you'll go to hell and burn for eternity. You must believe this. Well, Americans of my generation, like Emerson and Thoreau before us, said, well, we don't really like being told what to believe, and we don't like, and the things you're asking us to believe don't make any sense. I'm sorry, but they don't hold up to reason or the known facts of history or the known facts of science. And, if I have to believe that, I'll take my chances and I'll go look elsewhere. And that was happening in huge numbers. I didn't have to do that because I was raised by atheists, so I didn't have a religion to reject. I had atheism to reject, and that came later. And then people discovered the Sanatana Dharma teachings. They discover Vedanta because you can turn your back on your own religion, but it doesn't mean you lose your sense of spiritual essence and the urge to relate to something bigger than yourself and discover, what is possible spiritually. And so people looked elsewhere, and in my generation it was easy to find. There were gurus, there were books, there was, all kinds of ways to get into Dharmic teachings. And we said, oh wait, there's a different way of understanding the spiritual life and the religious life. There's this inner vertical aspect that has not to do with belief, but to one's own inner experience and one's own inner connection to the divine. And that's what the yogis are telling us is of value. No guru ever came to America and said you had to be a Hindu. No guru ever came and said, this is what you must believe in. They said, this is our Dharma, these is our teachings, explore them, see if they work for you, find your way into it, and if you want to be a Christian, these teachings may help you be a deeper and better Christian. And that was a message that was so welcome to so many people, and a revelation that religion could, what we call religion, could be that way. And now the polls show people have shifted from belief-centered religion to experience-centered spirituality. This separation of religion as a set of dogmas and institutions to spirituality as something one searches for in a personal way has come to dominate American religious trends. So part of that is a move away from identification, religious identification being determined by the tribe you belong to or the institution you have allegiance to your own personal essential quest. And ever since the day of Swami Vivekananda articulating the different paths of yoga, we've understood, those of us who have explored it, that there are many pathways, and one has to find one's way into it. This was another welcome message, and it was embraced to the point where this has come to characterize the majority of spiritual attitudes in America. And along those lines, as you heard earlier, most Americans 40, 50, 60 years ago, I should say most Christian Americans, because Jews were never really like that, but there is a tiny percentage of Americans. Religious Americans had this attitude that their way is the one true way. They didn't always agree which form of Christianity was the one true way, and Catholics would fight with Protestants and they would argue, but there was a sense that Jesus is the one Savior of mankind, and our religion is the culmination, and all the others, especially those in the East, are primitive and backward, and everybody should come to Jesus. And this attitude has diminished to the point of almost obscurity in America now. And that's what the Newsweek article focused on. Polls that show that if you ask Americans, do faiths and traditions other than your own have validity? Can people achieve spiritual realization or religious fulfillment through other pathways? More than 70% now say yes. This would have been unthinkable 50 years ago or 60 years ago. And a big part of the reason for that change was our exposure to Sanatana Dharma. And if that Rig Veda expression, I'm not going to risk saying the Sanskrit, you know it better than I do, but that has always been translated as truth is one, the wise call it by many names, which in America at least is the motto of the Ramakrishna Vivekananda centers. That is so deeply consistent with American values that when Americans hear this kind of thing, they've embraced it to the point where it is now the sort of dominant way people understand religion and the relationship of the diversity of traditions in the world. This is a tremendous shift, and it should make people very optimistic. Well, there are still those, of course. There's always that backlash from people who believe their way is the one true way. Those are the disgraceful missionaries who are coming here doing awful things. They're doing it in America too, but there are fewer and fewer of them over time. And as I mentioned earlier when I said Emerson was our American Shankaracharya. We have moved from the dominant religious attitude toward the God or the divine was always that we are doomed to be separate, that God is something out in the sky somewhere looking over us. And that has shifted to a very Vedantic attitude of the divine being transcendent and immanent and in us and without us, and that we are part of that divine fabric, and that our goal is to achieve union of individual consciousness and what you know of as Brahman. And finally, and this relates to it, the teachings have changed the way Americans understand who they are, who we are, what is our essence, what is the self. Old religion in America was your deepest part of you, you are a sinner, you are depraved, you are doomed to be, unless you believe in what we tell you to believe, you will be doomed to separation. It was Americans are great separational people. We separate things. We analyze and separate. We do that in science. We did it in religion. This yogic unity, this Vedantic sense of the unity of the self and all things has come to be a dominant attitude in America. It's, as I put it, a shift from original sin to original bliss. Now, this doesn't mean most Americans have never heard the phrase tattvam asi. But they've heard the essence of what that means through a variety of ways in English forms. They have come to accept that their innermost self is divine. They may never have heard Sat Chit Ananda, but they have heard and they've recognized and understood that their essential nature is infinite bliss and not sin and depravity. These are tremendous shifts in American attitudes and American life, and many people like me are conscious of where these teachings came from and are extremely grateful to India and its great heritage of sages and seers and yogis. Other Americans have no idea where these things came from. They just filtered into their lives and they embrace them. But I'm going to play a brief video now because it's easy to say, well, American intellectuals and hippies and people on the cutting edge are affected by these ideas. But it has seeped into the fabric of America to the point where little signs of it show up in the strangest places. And this video, which I learned earlier, some of you have already seen, because it's on YouTube, is my favorite and most entertaining evidence for what I say. So bear with me for a few minutes.
Namaste, that's a Hindu term. Namaste, say that. Say it again. Namaste, Jerome, means the divinity within me salutes the divinity within you. Y'all missed it. Namaste means the divinity within me salutes the divinity within you. Now, Flag, this simply means I recognize that Bobby has some God in him. See, many of our boys don't have any respect for life. That's why it's so easy to kill him. So when I realize that Bobby got some God in him, just as I have some God in me, that will make me respect him not only physically, but I'll respect what I say about Bobby. We have not been taught to respect one another, so I need you to say it again. Namaste. Say it again. Namaste. The divinity within me salutes the divinity Any teaching going on here today? And maybe that's why we have been mistreating one another for much too long. I want us to start today to say that word over and over. I want men and women, young and old, to start greeting one another instead of saying, what's happening? Young folk, when you greet somebody, namaste. Say it, why? Namaste. Say it again. Namaste. What does that mean?
That takes place. He's preaching in a traditional African American church in the deep south of America. This is Georgia, and it's not Atlanta, Georgia. It's a smaller place in Georgia, the heart of the fundamental Christian world, conservative Christianity. He wasn't just giving them a new word to use. He was giving them a teaching. He was changing the theology that they're accustomed to. They're not accustomed to hearing that they're divine, and we're all divine by nature. They're accustomed to hearing that God is somewhere out there, and we're here, and we have to satisfy God, and He'll take care of us, and all that old Judeo-Christian way of looking at religion. This is that's why this is a kind of significant thing, and that sort of experience is repeated in many parts of America over and over again. Even people going to yoga classes because their doctor said it would be good for their back pain, or because they want to look better. The yoga teacher may greet them with namaste. There may be an om symbol on the wall. There may be something that points them in the direction of a whole different way of understanding the world and themselves. And that's how the teachings take root. It came to us through the great gurus and swamis, beginning with Swamiji in 1893, who left behind a legacy of centers throughout the country that became the home, the spiritual home of a tremendous number of prominent Americans who absorbed Vedanta and then went on to propagate it in the lives of Americans, such as Houston Smith, who wrote the foreword to my book and is one of the great eminent scholars of religion in American history, who studied as a young man with a Swami in St. Louis in the middle of America and changed the way he understood religion, and he went on to write a very Vedantic textbook on comparative religion that has been read by 5 or 10 million American students. And then the next of the great yogis to come was Paramahansa Yogananda, who many of you know settled in America in 1920 and lived there for the next 32 years of his life, and had a tremendous impact, and to this day has a tremendous impact. His centers are all over the country, and his autobiography has sold tens of millions of copies around the world, and was the most often mentioned book when I interviewed people, and they said how they first learned about Vedanta and Hindu Dharma. And then, as I said, there was an explosion of gurus that came in the late 60s and 70s when my generation couldn't get enough of these teachings, and I put them all together in a collage, and if your favorite guru is missing, I apologize. And their legacy continues. All of them but two are gone, but they trained Americans and others to carry on their teachings. They left behind centers and ashrams and books and all kinds of other means of transmission that are still being felt in America and the rest of the world. But it is also interesting that certain of the great teachers who grew up in this soil and had such a great realization and impact never came to America, but they still had an impact because of people who were their followers bringing their teachings to us. And the two principal sources in that category are Ramana Maharshi and Sri Aurobindo, who are better known now 63 years after their passing, better known now in America than they were in their lifetimes, because the value of their work and their being has been appreciated more and more over time. And that tradition of gurus coming to America and attracting large numbers of following continues with these are the two most popular now. You know who they are. Sri Ravi Shankar is nice enough to advertise my book. And Amma hugs millions of people every year. But it wasn't just the gurus and the swamis and the yogacharyas. They were the ground troops. But there were also the books and the Americans who absorbed the teachings and became teachers in their own right. We don't have time to go into all who they were and how it happened. That's why you write a 350-page book. But as we've heard, it started with Emerson and Thoreau, and it continued with a whole stream of scientists and psychologists and scholars and artists and poets like T.S. Eliot, who was mentioned earlier, and Walt Whitman and Allen Ginsberg, and novelists like Hermann Hesse and J.D. Salinger. All these people who absorbed the teachings and expressed them through the arts and through the sciences. And I want to make special note of the role of, here's Aldous Huxley with Swami Prabhavananda, studying Vedanta with him in the 1940s. And I want to make special note of two things. One, Western religious leaders, mostly Christians, but also some Jews and rabbis in smaller numbers, embraced the teachings of Sanatana Dharma, and it changed the way they understood and practiced and taught their own religions. So I know a rabbi, for example, who calls himself an Advaita rabbi. He's a devotee of Ramakrishna. He teaches a different kind of religion, a religion that would almost, if it arose in India, it would be another sampradaya of Vedanta, or Vedantic teachings. And the same thing with many Catholics and traditional Protestants who have found their way to a different understanding of their own the origins of their own religion. There are, I have no numbers, but especially in my generation, huge numbers of Christians who turned away from their church because they couldn't accept the dogmas and the fear-based teachings they were getting. But they had a love for Jesus in their hearts, but they couldn't abide by the church, and they went searching, and they met gurus, and they read Yogananda's books where he talks about Jesus, and their gurus always spoke so highly of Jesus too, and they couldn't understand why. And they came away with a different understanding. So now there's millions of Christians who see Jesus as a great Sadguru, not as the savior of the world, but as a Sadguru. And I've heard this next thing from more Americans than you could believe. Oh, you spend time with Guru so-and-so, you're a member of this Vedantic or yoga lineage, but you also are a Christian, you go to church. Oh yes, Jesus is my Ishta Devata. And where did they learn that? They learned that maybe from a Swami or a guru who said, no, you don't have to turn your back on your own religion to accept these teachings. I was at a conference at a university in Los Angeles where I live, and it was an interfaith sort of gathering, and people were talking about the different religions, and there was a bunch of students. And one student, there was a Swami from the Ramakrishna lineage, and he talked about Vedanta, and this young student said to him, well, I find that what you said so appealing and so attractive, but I can't go to your temple and learn more because, I really love Jesus. I'm a Christian. He said, no, come, and if you want to learn and be initiated into our tradition, you can just take Jesus as your Ishta Devata, and that'll be fine with us. Well, this was such a revelation. This was an unthinkable way of dealing with the pluralism of beliefs and loyalties and so forth. That was, you could just see in her face this tremendous change. And the other thing I want to focus on is the role of music, because the other Ravi Shankar, the great virtuoso Ravi Shankar, was one of the leading lights of Sanatana Dharma in America. When he came to the West and he introduced Indian classical music first to classical music fans and then to jazz artists, and then, of course, when George Harrison and he got together so George could learn to play the sitar, suddenly Ravi Shankar was giving concerts to thousands and thousands of people, and people wanted to know why this music had a different effect on them than the music they were accustomed to. And so he would tell them it has deep roots in this India's spiritual tradition. And that was one of the ways young Americans started to explore Vedanta and Sanatana Dharma, because the music was so appealing. And when George Harrison studied sitar with Ravi Shankar gave him Vivekananda's books to read and Yogananda's books, and George became essentially a Hindu, as Hindu as a Westerner could be, and was a great proponent of the Dharma for the rest of his life, and brought his fellow Beatles to meet Maharishi Mahesh Yogi in 1967, and they learned his transcendental meditation. And the Beatles were so big, so famous, so revered by young people that overnight everybody knew what a mantra was, and everybody knew what meditation was, and you didn't have to be a hermit in a cave to meditate. You could do it every day, because after all, John Lennon is doing it, and he's telling everybody it's changed his life. This was a huge moment in the history of East-West integration, bigger than anybody can possibly imagine until you look at the news coverage of these events. And when the Beatles went to Rishikesh, it exploded even more. What happened was millions of young people, or tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, on the example of their musical heroes, the Beatles, started looking at meditation and yoga and doing it in large numbers. The teachings changed their lives, just as they changed mine. They were better and bigger human beings. Scientists saw what was happening to these young people and said, why is this happening? Let's do some studies. I was the subject of one of those studies. I was a young meditator going to the meditation center in Cambridge, Massachusetts. They asked for volunteers because somebody at Harvard Medical School wanted to see what happens in the body when you meditate. And so I sat in a little cubicle with a blood pressure cuff on and EEG wires coming out of my head, and I meditated like I was taught. And so I'm a little data point in a study that was published in major scientific journals and got a lot of attention, and then more studies were done, and more studies were done, and within a few years, practices like meditation and hatha yoga had moved from the hippy-dippy counterculture into the mainstream, symbolized by Clint Eastwood going on television and talking about how meditation has helped his life. And that has led to, 40 years later, to Oprah Winfrey being the one. And you don't get more mainstream than Oprah Winfrey. This scientific validation of the methods of yoga has had a huge impact on the West, which is why now doctors tell their patients to meditate, because they'll be healthier and they won't have to be on drugs. This has been a huge factor, and it led to the popularity of Hatha Yoga, with 20 million Americans taking yoga classes, and this development sort of opened the gates to the other aspects of Sanatana Dharma now becoming more well-known and popular in America. I don't know if you know this, but kirtan is now a huge phenomenon in America. No one could have predicted this. So the bhakti element of the Dharma has sort of taken hold now, and there are kirtan festivals and kirtanwalas who sell out large auditoriums. It's phenomenal. There's even hip-hop Puranas. If you're curious, Google MC Yogi. He's a young American whose parents were devotees of Swami Muktananda, and he does hip-hop versions of the stories of Ganesha and Hanuman and so forth, reaching young people by the thousands. And so in this way, the teachings have come and taken different forms and taken root in America and found devotees and found enthusiasts. And what's significant, I'll just end with this, what's significant is that it has reached into different aspects of American life. It has reached deeply spiritual people like Emerson and me and so many others who are searching for a different way of being a spiritual being in the world, and who have shaped their own spiritual lives around Sanatana Dharma. But it has also influenced Christians to change the way they practice Christianity, and Jews from how they practice their Judaism and understand their Judaism. And it has reached secular America, atheist America, non-religious America through the sciences. And in the end, you realize that one of the great glories of Sanatana Dharma is this universality, this versatility. There are people who meditate and do yoga and read Vedanta who have don't think of themselves as religious. They just want a better life. They want a healthier life. They want a life that's not limited to selfish and egotistical drives. And they turn to the Hindu Dharma and the Buddhist Dharmas in a secular way and in an evidence-based way. The teachings work, I do it. And that's kind of the American spirit. I've learned a lot in the last 2 weeks here, and so I've come to sort of change how I end my talks. I've recognized that there's been great concern among people like you for the younger generation of Indians who you're afraid are turning their backs on their own dharmic traditions and are looking to America for inspiration and as a model. And I find it's so ironic, and when I speak, I've spoken to a lot of youth groups since I'm here, and I always tell them, if you're going to look to America for inspiration and as a model, make sure you look at the right things. There are good things to emulate about America, but there are things you don't want to adopt. And I always joke and I say, cell phones are a good adoption. Coca-Cola, no. Monsanto, no. The way we eat, no. The Americans I know eat more like Indians than they do, Americans, because they want to be healthy. But the other thing I tell them is, and this has dawned on me recently, America's kind of a laboratory for the world. For better and for worse, we have this tremendous influence, often for ill, sometimes for good. But one of the great characteristics of American life is it's a very experimental culture. It's a very open-minded culture. And so we invent things, and if they work, we adopt them, and suddenly everybody has them. We take things from other cultures, and if we like it, it becomes part of America. We've brought in musical forms, art forms, foods, and they become part of the American palate and the American landscape. We're evidence-based. There's these Americans who are very closed-minded and resist something that's new or something that's foreign. But most Americans are wide open and, oh, this is a new thing, let's check it out, let's look at it. And if it turns out to work, if it turns out to make their lives better, they'll adopt it. That's what we did with the teachings of Vedanta and yoga. The teachings intellectually held up to reason and analysis, unlike Western religion theology, which often does not. And the practices, as I mentioned, held up to scientific investigation, and so they became part of the healthcare system and part of the psychology disciplines and part of the spiritual landscape of America because they work. So I hate to be in a position of advising people in India about their own dharma, which is, a crazy development in the world. But as a reporter who's seen what I've seen in America, if the young generation of Indians wants to imitate something about America, one good thing to imitate is we've adopted Sanatana Dharma. we have proven through our experience, unintentionally perhaps, that the teachings that so many people assumed are old-fashioned and irrelevant and holding back progress in modern life are not irrelevant. They are not museum pieces. They are not library relics. They are living, valuable teachings that are appropriate for the modern life and can help modern life and can make modern life more complete, more integrated, healthier, and more fulfilling. People like me have found that in our lives. The evidence is there. It's in scientific literature. Sanatana Dharma is no more out of date than the laws of physics are out of date. They just they're just there, ready to be applied in different ways, the way they've always been, the way physics is, the way the laws of chemistry are. And that's how many Americans have come to see these teachings, not as religious dogma, but as a great science of being, a great and applicable to anybody's life, which is exactly what Swami Vivekananda and all the other gurus said, and it turns out they were right, and we've proven it. And I'm just going to close the way I close my book, because I think that the development that I describe in here of the West embracing Sanatana Dharmic teachings and demonstrating their value to modern life is a tremendously important development in history. And I was very happy to come across this quote because then I didn't have to say it. Somebody with a much better reputation than I was able to say it. This is the great British historian Arnold Toynbee. One of the better things that Britain gave the world, and one of the great historians. You probably have heard him. He said this in 1969, and I chose to end the book with this. It is already becoming clear that a chapter which had a Western beginning will have to have an Indian ending if it is not to end in the self-destruction of the human race. At this, there's more. At this supreme, maybe I should stop now. Okay. At this supremely dangerous moment in human history, The only way of salvation for mankind is the Indian way. Here we have the attitude and the spirit that can make it possible for the human race to grow together into a single family, and in the atomic age, this is the only alternative to destroying ourselves. That still strikes me as a way to end an event. And so I will say, in the spirit of the video I showed you, namaste, and thank you for having me.